What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another breaking news episode here on Mets Central. And in today's episode, obviously, like I said, breaking news because earlier today we got news that the Mets have made another trade and they moved on from another piece of the old core as Jeff McNeil, we have been speculating about this topic for a while now in the offseason, ever since the Marcus Semien and Brandon Nimmo trade happened. But today it was officially announced that Jeff McNeil was traded to the Sacramento Athletics, the Oakland Athletics, or the soon to be Las Vegas Athletics, whatever you want to call them. But it was officially made earlier today. Jeff McNeil is officially a new member of the A's. And for me, listen, I'm not going to sugarcoat this. Obviously, you guys know in the chat, the people who have been watching us for a while, you guys have known for a while, like I said, that we've been wanting for David Stearns to move on from this old core. And another piece has been finally moved on from. Obviously, last month we saw Brandon Nimmo be dealt to the Texas Rangers for Marcus Semien in return. We obviously saw earlier in the months, we saw Edwin Diaz decide to sign with the LA Dodgers and leave the Mets ever since being here from 2019, where he was acquired from the Seattle Mariners. We saw Pete Alonso leave as well as he signed a 5-year deal with the Baltimore Orioles. And like I said recently today, the Mets have finally made the move to move on from Jeff McNeil. And look, I want to start off before we even get into the main details of the trade. Obviously, there aren't a ton of main details to go over this trade because it was a fairly simple trade, going over this. But look, for Jeff McNeil, I'm not gonna lie. Even though like both me and Evan, we both wanted him gone, Jeff McNeil was a good Met in his own right. However, like we have talked about before, and we've talked about, coming down the stretch of the regular season where this team collapsed and coming to this offseason, we said that it was finally time to move on from this core. And listen, there were a lot of ways to do it. I'm gonna be honest with you guys. The fact that we're now here and we're looking at this roster in a whole totally different new shape with guys like Nimmo, Alonso, Diaz, and McNeil all out. Like I said, I'm not gonna lie. If you told me, you know, even what from the start of last season, or even if we were to go back a year ago today to this date in 2024, if you guys told me, or if I told myself that all four of those guys would not be here, I would have been completely shocked. And even if we just went back to the start of the offseason, because even though there was rumors that the Mets were looking to shop Brandon Nimmo, we thought, okay, it probably wasn't realistic because of the contract, but it happened. Then we obviously saw Diaz walk. We obviously saw Alonso walk. And we were kind of looking at this. I'm like, sorry, guys. But we were obviously looking at this and we were saying, like, okay, like, if Jeff McNeil is the only person out of this core that's going to survive, because he was the last remaining player that's left from the 2019 team. So, and that's even crazy that we're even sitting here and saying this, that every single person from the 2019 roster is gone. I mean, that is just crazy because we've seen this team, this group, this roster, come through all these years. Obviously, they come up short. We've talked about it many times. The 2021 collapse, the 2022 collapse, even though they made the playoffs, the 2023 disaster, the 2024 season, yes, that was great, but that was an outlier season. And, the 2025 season, which again was just an out and out disaster. So, like I said, it was time to move on, but I am going to thank Jeff McNeil for his time here because he was a good Met. Obviously, he came up in 2018, and obviously he played well for a short time in the second half. Then came here or made the team in 2019 again, still played very well. 2020 decent season. 2021 had a little bit of a down year, but then obviously we saw the comeback of the obviously we saw the comeback of Jeff McNeil in 2022, where he ended up having the best batting average in all of Major League Baseball, ended up winning the batting title. Obviously, we know that Billy Epler ended up signing him to that 4-year extension. Obviously, looking at that extension now in hindsight, it wasn't a smart extension at the time, and it just didn't work out. And then obviously we saw McNeil start to decline again from 2023, 2024. And even though he had a solid season in 2025, again, I know if you look at the batting average, it definitely didn't look like what Jeff McNeil put up in those 2019, 2022 seasons. But, we start to see him hit for a lot more power. You start to see the home runs be more incorporated into his game. But all around, for where this roster is going and for where David Stearns wants to take this roster, which he wants more better defensive players, He wants more versatility. He wants more of a quote unquote younger team, a team more with tools. Jeff McNeil just didn't fit that type of role because look, even though Jeff McNeil is quote unquote a versatile player because even though his primary position is second base, but he could play a little bit of the outfield, he could maybe play a little bit of third base, but really when you look at McNeil's defensive metrics all around the diamond, it wasn't up to par with what the Mets needed at this time. And we're obviously seeing them going through this transition because obviously, their defense lacked a lot last year. I mean, they took a major step back from where they were in 2024 defensively. And part of the reason was that Jeff McNeil just wasn't a great fit for where this team needs to be, and that's why they moved on from him. And listen, obviously he's now with the A's, so good luck to him. Obviously he's from California, so hopefully he could kind of not get. I don't think Jeff will ever get back to his peak of what he was in 2019, 2022. But hopefully for the A's, if he could just go there, be a solid player along with guys like Brent Rooker, Nick Kurtz, Jacob Wilson, guys like that. Hopefully he'll fit nice into that roster. But like I said, for where this team was going right now and for the direction that they were going in, Jeff McNeil just wasn't a great fit. And obviously, like I said, they moved on from him. And looking at the trade, obviously, I think one of our main concerns with Jeff McNeil going out the door was, it was really because obviously the Mets were looking to get rid of him. I mean, that was clearly made from the start of the offseason when you heard from the rumors, when you look at the guys that they were trying to move on from. McNeil was definitely one of those guys that they were trying to move on from. But the main sticking point was, which team is going to look to take it? Because obviously, when you look at some of the other teams, some of the other top teams in Major League Baseball, they already have decent or better second baseman than Jeff McNeil. And considering the type of money that Jeff McNeil was on, it was kind of a sticky point. Like, okay, what is the right landing spot for Jeff McNeil? And even, from the start of the offseason, we even got the rumors that teams like the Pittsburgh Pirates were, openly considering trading for Jeff McNeil. But obviously that rumor started to die down as a couple days ago. They made the trade to acquire Brandon Lau from the Tampa Bay Rays. And then obviously we even had the rumors before then, which was around the same time that the Pittsburgh Pirates rumors came out that the A's were interested in trading for Jeff McNeil. And at that time, I was like, okay, can the A's kind of make this deal? Because we know that the A's are a team that really doesn't like to spend money. I know that they signed Luis Severino last year to that 3-year deal, but typically we know that the A's, especially under this ownership group, maybe that's going to change now since, they're going to, they're relocated to Vegas in a couple years. But like I said, we know that the A's are more of a frugal team. They don't like to spend. They have more of that Moneyball approach, and they're more conservative in terms of who they look to bring in, especially with teams on big contracts. But thankfully, that really wasn't too much of a problem because the Mets were still able to trade him, and they were able to still dump around $10 million. Obviously, the Mets did have to send back a little bit of money to make this deal happen, and they did also acquire another pitcher as well. Let me just pull up the name of the pitcher, guys. Give me 1 second. But okay, yeah, and the pitching prospect was a 17-year-old from the A system, and he was playing in rookie ball last year. And the guy's name is Yordan Rodriguez. Like I said, 17 years old, prospect from rookie ball. So we really don't have too much information on him. And look, for Yordan Rodriguez, whether he makes the roster or not, like later down the line, because like I say, the guy's still 17 years old. So even if he does crack the major league level at some point, it's probably not going to be around till like 2030, 2031. So there is going to be a lot of time before we even see this guy come anywhere close near the major league level. But listen, the Mets got a player back. They were able to dump a large portion of that contract. Obviously they're still covering $5 million or $5.5 million around in that salary, and they are also covering the buyout that the team has with Jeff McNeil. Because if you guys recall, Jeff McNeil does have a club option on his contract for next year. And since we know, like I said, that the A's don't really like to spend a lot of money, and that McNeil is going to be making $15.75 million next year, you could imagine that the A's will probably decline that club option of Jeff McNeil, and he's going to enter free agency unless Jeff McNeil just has like a type of season where he has in 2022, 2019, where, he wins the batting title, he gets back to hitting 300 or above, he's hitting like 20 home runs, or he's playing elite defenses at second base, or, wherever the A's decide to play him. But I don't think that's going to happen. So probably most likely the A's going to decline that option, and McNeil is going to enter free agency, and the Mets will end up covering that portion of the contract. So, but yeah, listen, I mean, all around good trade for the Mets. Obviously, this now opens up another hole on the roster. So it's another position that the Mets will need to cover, and obviously, that's going to allow us to jump to our next topic of this trade reaction live stream, because there were rumors also that the Mets are potentially looking at trading for Ketel Marte, which is kind of interesting. But guys, before we do move on to that portion of the show, I'm just going to go through your guys' comments and see what you guys have to say. Game Shorts, what is going on? Knew you guys would be live for this. What is going on, Matt? I am well. Game for Shorts for you. How are you? Obviously, it's always a good night when the Mets move on from Jeff McNeil, because, like I said, even though Jeff McNeil was a good Met, it was time to move on from him. This core had not won anything, and it's another step in the right direction. But obviously, now that McNeil's gone, you're gonna have to replace him. And I know that technically the Mets have already replaced Jeff McNeil because they traded for Marcus Semien, but you're gonna need to replace the production, and you're gonna need to replace the roster spot with another good player. And obviously, that player could be the next guy that we're going to talk about on this live stream. J Star, what's going on? What happened to Evan? I'm concerned. Evan's fine. Evan's fine. I'm not sure if you're I'm not sure if you're really talking about like the Twitter stuff or the Ranger Central stuff. But if you missed that live stream he did, which was like 2.5 months ago, Evan was basically taking a break from the Rangers and covering the Rangers because, let's be honest, who the fuck wants to talk about that decrepit and old and shitty hockey team? And he's obviously taking a break off Twitter as well. But he's been here doing live streams with me on Met Central. Obviously, he's been on the last 3-4 breaking news live streams where we talked about either signings like Luke Weaver, Devin Williams, or Pete Alonso, or Edwin Diaz being traded away. And he was even on the stream where we even we collaborated with Mets Weekly with both Carson and Andrew, breaking down the Brandon Nimmo trade to the Texas Rangers for Marcus Semien. So sorry, guys. I don't know why my camera went away. I'm going to try to fix this really quickly. But, yeah, Evan's fine. He's obviously just been, kind of just taking a step back from the Rangers thing. But, yeah, really, other than that, Evan's been fine, and he's been on the channel. So, yeah, I don't know. There's not really, a reason to be that concerned about him. Evan is fine, and he's doing all right. No, Andrew, no late night McNeil glazing, shaking my head. Unfortunately not, Andrew. Unfortunately not. Jeff McNeil had to be traded, and, we're not going to be glazing average players here on Met Central. That is just not what we do. But if you guys had not checked out Carson and Andrew, they did their own trade reaction live on Mets Weekly earlier today. So, and I obviously watched that. I was commenting in the comment section, and, I was very entertained as always watching that YouTube channel, because both Carson and Andrew do a very good job, as well as Frank, even though he was not on that live stream. So if you guys had not checked out that live stream, make sure you guys do, because like I said, they create some very good Mets content over there on Mets Weekly. Game Shorts again. The Mets are making moves, that's for sure. They have made a ton of moves already, far more than any other team. I still think they have a lot of tricks up their sleeve too. Look, obviously 100%, because the Mets, they have a lot of holes right now in the roster. Obviously, they need a left fielder. They need a center fielder. They need another first baseman / DH to pair with a guy like Jorge Polanco. And even there are question marks about, whether, maybe as a guy like Brett on the roster. I'm sorry, guys. I don't know why I can't get my camera going. This is kind of frustrating, but I'm trying my best here. Hold on. I think I might have got it. There we go. All right. Finally back here. But yeah, like I said, that's also not even considering that the Mets are probably still going to look to add another reliever or two. Obviously, there were the rumors with San Diego Padres, that the Mets might be looking to acquire, multiple guys like Adrian Morjon, Mason Miller, Jeremiah Estrada, and even there are other moves for starting pitchers that the Mets could make. Obviously, Nick Pivetta was one of those guys that was named in the trade rumors going the other way from the San Diego Padres to the Mets. And also, there are other guys as well on the free agent market that the Mets could look to acquire. And now, look, I know that, the Mets and David Stearns have not shown a tendency to go after those bigger names on the free agent market in terms of starting pitchers, and, and more so those middle of the tier market arms. But I think if a guy like Framber Valdez does, his market starts to crash and he's not signed by the time, February rolls around, I think you could see a guy like Framber Valdez be signed for the Mets on like a 2, 3 year deal with opt outs. I think more 3 year deal because if you're going to allow Framber Valdez to opt out, I think you're going to allow him to opt out after at least he's been here for guaranteed 2 years because you guys have to remember that Framber Valdez has a qualifying offer also attached to him. So, it really wouldn't make sense if the Mets were to sign Framber Valdez to like a 3 year deal with opt outs after the first, second year, give up a draft pick, and then Valdez ends up leaving after 1 year, and you give up a draft pick for basically 1 year of Framber Valdez. It's very similar to what we saw with the Michael King contract because if you guys remember, obviously Michael King was another target of the Mets, and he ended up re-signing with the San Diego Padres on a 3 year deal, and a fairly good deal for the Padres as well. And he was giving opt outs after year one and year two of that deal. But the reason the Padres felt comfortable in doing that is because obviously he's going back to the Padres, so the Padres wouldn't be giving up a draft pick to get Michael King since he was already there next year. So, but listen, and the other thing, like you talking about game shorts with the Mets having tons of moves up their sleeves, in this offseason, David Stearns has made a lot of moves that have kind of gone under the radar. I mean, obviously, we really had no idea that Jorge Polanco was going to be signed. We really didn't have any idea that a guy like Luke Weaver was going to be signed. Obviously, like with the guys going away, we knew that those guys, were going to be traded. The only obvious one, not the only obvious one that doesn't fit that criteria was a guy like Brandon Nimmo, because obviously, like I said, we didn't think that a guy like Nimmo would be traded just based off what his contract had remaining, 5 years, and then plus the no trade clause. So, we didn't think that was going to happen, but it ended up happening. So, and like I said, that was a move that went under the radar. And obviously, like I said, you could say the Devin Williams one, and that the Devin Williams one did kind of come out under the radar, but I think it was kind of more easy to predict just because there was already that pre-established connection between Devin Williams and David Stearns, because they were together in their time in Milwaukee. But like I said, for the most part, the Mets and David Stearns have been very quiet in terms of this offseason, in terms of what the moves are going to be. So I mean, you never know when the next move is going to happen, and you never know what that next player the Mets are going to acquire. So obviously we'll see we'll see what happens with that. NGPS, what is going on? I will never forget Unk's 2 run homer against the Yankees on 4th of July. Yeah, that was a great moment last year, and that was off against now current New York Met Luke Weaver. So hopefully next season, because the A's actually do come to Citi Field in the second homestand of the season next year. Hopefully, if Luke Weaver's facing Jeff McNeil, hopefully we do not get a repeat of that home run, and hopefully it's Luke Weaver striking out Jeff McNeil, or just getting him out. Whichever way it works, I don't care as long as he gets him out. I just don't want to see Jeff McNeil hitting a home run off Luke Weaver ever again because Luke Weaver is now our pitcher. Ray, what is going on? He needed to go. The love for McNeil ran its course. Yeah, listen, 100%. And listen, like I stated at the beginning of the live stream, listen, I liked Jeff McNeil. He was a good Met, not a great Met, but he definitely did have his good moments, and he had his good seasons, like we said in 2019 and 2022 when he won the batting title. But it was just time to move on because again, this core and this group of players ran its course, and you needed to try something new, and you needed to go in another direction because again, like we said, this core failed. Hornet, what is going on? The Squirrel had a great July and August, but then fell off a cliff. Yeah, listen, like I said, McNeil had a fairly decent season this year, but again, it kind of just came in moments because there were some points of the season where he wasn't great, but then there were some points, like you said, Hornet, where in July and August he was really good. And I mean, even that goes back to NG's comment of the 2 run home run off Luke Weaver in the Subway Series against the Yankees on July 4th. Jay Starker, did he deactivate his Twitter? Yes, he did. If in case you are wondering, don't be saying that name so fast. If you're referring to Nick Kurtz, yes, do not say that name too quickly because you might get taken out of context for something that you didn't say. But we will move on from that, Andrew. Hornet again. Lindor may be happier tonight. I mean, I don't know if you guys saw it, and I don't think it had any connection with it. But if it did, it would have been kind of funny because right after the trade went down, Lindor made a post, I believe it was on his Instagram, that said that, he's already excited for the next season. And it was kind of a video of him taking grounders. So, like I said, I don't think there was any type of connection to the trade, but I definitely do think that Francisco Lindor is a little bit happier that Jeff McNeil is no longer on this roster because it was clear from the scuffle in 2021 with the whole rat raccoon thing, where Lindor choked Jeff McNeil down the runway going towards the clubhouse, and then obviously we went over this on a couple live streams ago where McNeil and Lindor had that scuffle in Philadelphia on a failed turn double play. So it was clear that those guys just didn't get along, and thankfully, and obviously, there were the rumors already that the Mets clubhouse wasn't already in the greatest state. There was a lot of kind of tension and stuff, and obviously that goes hand in hand with the team not winning and them kind of having multiple chokes throughout the last couple of years. But yeah, like I said, thankfully he's gone. Lindor can be a little bit happier now, and yeah, hopefully we see him have another great season next year. Ray, again, salary dump 100%. Game shorts again. How many wins can you see this team at next year if they make a couple of other big moves? Well, listen, like you said, game shorts for you. I can't really make too much of a prediction right now, considering what the roster looks like. And I know people say, "Oh, the roster doesn't look great right now. The Mets look like a 70-win team." But guys, you have to remember this: we're coming towards the end of December. It's almost the new year. Obviously, there's still 2 months to go till spring training starts. The roster is going to look different. Like I said, there's still holes at left field, center field, first base / DH. Obviously, there will be a couple more relievers added. There should be at least a couple more starters added as well. Obviously, we'll still see if maybe a couple more starters even traded. Obviously, we heard the rumors that Kodai Senga may be moved, David Peterson may be moved. So I still think this team is going to look a lot different, come the start of the season and come the start of spring training. But look, if they make the correct moves, I don't see there's a reason why this team can't make the playoffs next year, and they should be making the playoffs, considering that you have Juan Soto in his prime, you still have Francisco Lindor in his prime, you still have some decent pitchers on the roster, both including bullpen and starting pitchers wise. Obviously, you did make the lineup a little bit deeper with adding a couple more veterans, like guys like Marcus Semien and guys like Jorge Polanco as well. But like I said, there are still moves to be made, and I expect when we get to the start of spring training and we get to opening day, I think we will look at this roster in a way that, okay, maybe they're not like going to be looked at as like guaranteed World Series favorites, because obviously the Dodgers are really like the only team that you could look at and say, okay, this, and the Blue Jays as well, where you could say, okay, this team is a bona fide World Series contender. But I think when we get to that point of February and opening day, where we will look at this team from top to bottom as a roster and say, okay, this is a very good and competitive ball club that can make the playoffs, and maybe if everything goes right, they can make a deeper in the playoffs and possibly win a World Series. Obviously, like I said, and that's not even counting the fact that, once we get to late July, early August, there's going to be a trade deadline to where the Mets could even make other moves to bolster their lineup or bolster their pitching staff. So I think, like I said, I think by the time we get to the start of spring training and opening day, people are going to look at this roster a little bit different. Hornet, or this is Game Shorts replying to Hornet. Well, I'm pretty sure he did like some of Instagram posts or Twitter right after the trade. Yeah, like I said, and that's going back to he made that post. Whether that's connected to the actual trade or not, who knows? But it is what it is. Andrew, oh Andrew, why must you be like this? And Game for Shorts, you were about to say Yordan Alvarez, Matt. Don't lie. I wasn't about to say Yordan Alvarez, but I was trying to get the name. Listen, if the Mets did get Yordan Alvarez back for Jeff McNeil, I think we would all be pretty happy. But obviously, it's not. It didn't happen because he got moved to the A's. But Yordan Rodriguez, what's going on? Yordan Rodriguez, obviously, like I said, 17 years old pitcher. We don't know a lot about him. So, and like I said, even when he is ready to get to the major league level, if he ever develops to that type of pitcher, or he's good enough to crack major league level, we're not going to see him until 2030, 2031. So it is going to be a little bit of time. But guys, before we do wrap up this live stream, we also do have another topic to talk about. And right after the trade went down, there was a post made by Francis Romero. If you guys don't follow him on Twitter, he's fairly reliable with Major League Baseball and breaking news. Obviously, he's not a Bob Nightingale type where he's 50-50 or most of his stuff doesn't happen. Francis Romero is a pretty credible source, and he ended up posting, with Jeff McNeil gone, the Mets are believed to be exploring Ketel Marte, or at least discussing him in trade talks, per an industry source. And When I saw this news, I got pretty excited because Ketel Marte is the type of bat that this lineup needs to strengthen it and even deepen it a little bit more. Now, I know you guys will look at Ketel Marte and say, but Matt, he's a second baseman. We already have a second baseman, Marcus Semien. How are you exactly going to align this? And yes, Ketel Marte mostly does play second base. However, there is ways that you can maneuver Ketel Marte around the diamond. Obviously, there are ways to where, you could maybe move him over to third base, or you could potentially move him over, or you could potentially move Marcus Semien over to third base. But I mean, and obviously Evan brought this up in our group chat earlier, when we were talking about this tweet, he was basically saying that, it really doesn't kind of make sense to move Marcus Semien around to third base just because, you brought him in to play second base and he is a gold glove caliber second baseman. And I do agree with that. I would not personally move Marcus Semien off second base. I would rather keep him there and move a guy like Ketel Marte over to third base because Marcus Semien's glove is that good at second base. But we also do have to remember, that Ketel Marte is getting a little bit older. He's already 35 years old, and I believe by the time we get to opening day, he might even already have turned 36, or maybe later in the season he might be 36 years old. But you could, what's it called, later down the line, whether it's year 2 or year 3 of the contract, if Marcus Semien is still here, maybe you could potentially move him over to third base, or DH, depending on whatever happens, or even however he ages. But hopefully, Semien ages fairly well, and you get to keep him at second base, and you get to keep that elite level love at second base. But like I said, for Ketel Marte, there is an opportunity where you could move him over to third base. You could move and trade a guy like Brett Beatty, or potentially, move him over to first base if that's an option. I wouldn't love that option too much. I would rather just flip Beatty for another player, whether that's for another position player like an outfielder, or even another starting pitcher. Maybe Brett Beatty could be one of those names, or one of those players being away to a team like the San Diego Padres for one of their relievers, plus a guy like Nick Pivetta. So there is a lot of ways you could get Ketel Marte into this lineup, and you could also move Ketel Marte out to the outfield, because if you guys recall, back in 2021 and even in those prior years with the Diamondbacks, he did play a little bit of the outfield. He played more center field, and obviously I don't know how much he graded out when he played center field, but you don't necessarily have to play him in center field, because you have a guy like Tyrone Taylor, you also have a guy like Carson Bench, but you could potentially move him over to the corners. Obviously, probably more left, or it probably depends, because maybe you do want to move Soto over to left field and then stick Ketel Marte out in right field, or maybe you just keep Soto there in right field, and you put Ketel Marte out there in left field. But there are multiple options, or even you could possibly just DH him and have Jorge Polanco play first base, or I don't know, maybe Ketel Marte is open to playing first base. I do not know personally, but I think if the Mets can find a way to make a guy like Ketel Marte work, and they can find a way to make that trade happen, I think you have to make that trade, because again, and Ketel Marte's on a fairly decent contract as well. Like I believe his contract doesn't end until 2030, 2031. So there is still a lot of years left on the Ketel Marte contract, but he is making fairly good money, because he's making 16 million this year. That then goes down to $12 million in 2027, and then 2028 it goes up to $20 million, and then for 2019, or not 2029 and 2030, his salary does go up to $22 million, and then he does have a player option for 2031, which is his age 37 year, but the salary goes down to $11.5 million. So if the Mets could find a way to get Ketel Marte, if they could find a way to trade for Ketel Marte, I think that's a trade that you have to explore. Now, what do the Diamondbacks want in return? I would imagine they would probably want some pitching. I know they brought back Merrill Kelly, but they are going to miss a whole season of Corbin Burns, because he got Tommy John surgery last year. So maybe do the Diamondbacks want a starting pitcher like a David Peterson? Maybe do they want a younger player like a Brandon Sproat? I certainly wouldn't trade Jonah Tong in this deal. Maybe, I mean, who knows? I do want to see what the Diamondbacks want in return for a guy like Ketel Marte. But like I said, maybe you trade a guy like Brett Beatty, Senga, Peterson, maybe a couple lower end level starting pitching prospects like a guy like Jonathan Santucci and other guys like that. So But Ketel Marte, like I said, he does fit the mold of what this team needs because Marte is also a switch hitter, so that lengthens the lineup in that sense because we talked about that. The Mets have kind of been more of a of a lefty heavy team per se, and they also haven't been the greatest team in terms of hitting lefties per se. And Ketel Marte is a switch hitter. Jorge Polanco is a switch hitter. Francisco Lindor is a switch hitter. So that would you know lengthen the lineup per se in that sense. So, and even Ketel Marte, even when you look at the stats, he's a fairly good, hitter. He's a fairly good hitter against left-handed hitters as well because played 74 games, 159 at bats, 184 plate appearances, 44 hits, 31 runs, 9 home runs, a 277 batting average. Let's see, an OPS of 891, a WRC plus of 143 as well. Like I said, 277 batting average, a 375 OPS. And also, one of the other things that's good about Ketel Marte, which we've kind of talked about here on Met Central, is that the Mets over the past couple of years have not been a great fastball hitting team. Well, when you look at the breakdowns of Ketel Marte and what type of hitter he is, when you look at his fastball splits, or when you look at the breakdown of splits by pitches, 302 batting average, 313 expecting batting average, a 524 slug, a 574 expected slugging. And then when you look at some of the other pitch types, whether it's a breaking ball or off speed, for breaking ball, 252 batting average, expected batting average of 265, 488 slug, expected slug of 500. And then with the off speed stuff, 281 batting average, expected batting average of 276, 531 slugging, and expecting slugging percentage of 462. And he also does pull the ball, and he does also put the ball in the air, which is something that we've kind of talked about, which is another thing that this Mets team needed to improve on. And again, Ketel Marte would fit the mold of a Jeff Albert and a Troy Snitker type of guy because obviously we saw the Mets, like I said, they brung in Jorge Polanco and they brung in Marcus Semien, which again are guys that pull the ball and put the ball in the air. So like I said, David Stearns is trying to remold this lineup and reshape it into a lineup that's more better for modern day baseball. And like I said as well, that helps when you have hitting coaches that have that same type of philosophy as well. Because like we saw last year, the main reason, and even for years prior, the main reason why this Mets lineup was so inconsistent was because they had so many type of different hitters, and they had two different type of hitting coaches, that were trying to teach and install two different type of hitting philosophies where sorry guys, where a guy like Eric Chavez was more of that old type, not pull the ball, put the ball on the ground, hit it to the opposite field, and then a guy like Jeremy Barnes was saying, more, hit the ball in the air, pull the ball, and like I said, when you have two different ideas mixing and colliding together, that's not going to get to through the player's head, and you're going to see struggles from some of these players, and you're not going to see them have the best of all offensive seasons. And like I said, that's one of the main reasons why we saw this team be so inconsistent the last couple of years, when Eric Chavez was here as the hitting coach. But hopefully now that guys like Jeff Albert and Troy Snitker are here, this Mets team, with the fact that they're adding more hitters that match their philosophy, hopefully you're going to see an offense that's a bit more consistent and that's a bit more dangerous, and they're going to look to attack fastballs and, like I said, hit the ball in the air and pull the ball, because this was something that this Mets team desperately needed. Because even when you look at the batted profile on Ketel Marte and Baseball Savant, pulls the ball 40.3%, opposite field 21.6%, and up the middle 38.1%, and even on the pull air percentage 23 and a half, which was actually the highest of his career. So like I said, if Ketel Marte, if the Mets can manage to swing a trade for a guy like Ketel Marte, I think that would be amazing, because like I said, it would just make the lineup a whole lot deeper. And obviously, like I said, after that, if the Mets are able to make the type of trade, there are still other, areas that this team needs to address. Obviously, the Mets still need a couple more outfielders, like we talked about. And obviously, the Luis Robert rumors are still floating around, which I know a lot of people maybe aren't necessarily the biggest fans of Luis Robert, because when you look at the stats and, when you look at just Luis Robert's I don't want to say his hitting profile because when you look at his hitting profile, it's actually decent. But like I said, when you look at the overall stats of Luis Robert, you're kind of turned off by it. But and this was kind of some of the things we've been discussing in our group chat along with Evan and Carson and other people like that. you know, I would be okay with bringing Luis Robert. One, because he has an elite glove in center field, and two, I know his bat hasn't been the greatest the last couple of years, but now that the Mets have better hitting coaches in Jeff Albert and Troy Snitker, now you feel a lot better in terms of them, trying to bring in a guy like Luis Robert and trying to unlock him and trying to get back and trying to get him to become what he was back in 21, 2022, where he was that very good dynamic offensive player that we saw on those Chicago White Sox teams that made the playoffs. So if the Mets do trade for Robert, hopefully we could see him, get back to that level where we saw him a couple years ago. And obviously, there is a reason why other teams are still trying to pursue him. There was a reason why a team like the Phillies was trying to pursue him. There's a reason why even the Dodgers, we heard some linkage to them. Luis Robert, I think there was a good player. I think there is a good player in there. I think he just needs a change of scenery, and I think he needs better coaching around him. And hopefully, like I said, if he comes to the Mets, obviously, when you look at the money wise, he's making $20 million next year. And we kind of heard that the Mets are totally not comfortable taking all of that money. And we also heard that the what's it called, that the Chicago White Sox are open to eating a bit of money as well in the contract. So like I said, if the White Sox are willing to eat some money and the Mets are willing to, to send a couple prospects there to Chicago to get Luis Robert, I would be personally okay with it. I'm not sure what you guys think about Robert in the comments, but we'll see what happens on that front. And obviously, there are still the rumors that maybe the Mets land a guy like Cody Bellinger or Kyle Tucker. Obviously, I think that all depends on just what happens with their contract status, because if their markets do decline and they are open to taking more shorter term deals, then I could see, guys like Cody Bellinger and Kyle Tucker being more possible for this team. But and I think this more so applies for Cody Bellinger, because I think if Cody Bellinger wants a 6-year deal plus, I don't see the Mets going for him. Kyle Tucker, would they maybe be more inclined to? Maybe just because he's a better overall player than a guy like Cody Bellinger. But still, I am not too sure if the Mets would give a guy like Kyle Tucker 8 years or more on that type of deal. And then also, like we said, there are rumors out there, and even there was another rumor earlier today. Let me try and find the tweet because I posted it in our group chat. But this was from Michael Marino. Posted this on Twitter. If you guys don't follow Michael Marino on Twitter, make sure you do, because he posts really good Mets updates on Twitter. But this was from Will Salmon and the Ken Rosenthal article. He stated that they at least stated that the Mets hold interest in adding a right-handed batter to balancing out their lineup. People familiar with their conversation said that that could end up being someone who also plays first base. And like we also talked about on our Jorge Polanco signing reaction, which if you guys didn't see, make sure you guys check that out. But we also said with the Jorge Polanco signing and the fact that he really has played a lot of first base, and we're kind of hoping that he's a more of a DH type role with a little bit of time at first base. We were kind of saying that we expect the Mets to go out there and add another similar type of player to that kind of mold, but more so a guy that has already experience at first base. And obviously, there are a couple guys out there who kind of do fit that mold. Obviously, we know that the Mets were linked to a guy like Willson Contreras from the St. Louis Cardinals, but unfortunately, that trade is not going to happen just because last night Willson Contreras was actually traded to the Boston Red Sox, so Contreras is off the market. But there are still a couple more guys that are out there, and even a guy like Murataka Murakami, he was also another option as well, but he went and signed with the White Sox, which I'm not too I'm really not too bothered about it, because I was not really big on signing Murataka Murakami. And one of the reasons for that was, because we've talked about plenty of times on these live streams that David Stearns has been prioritizing more defensive versatile players. And for a guy like Murakami, which we know that, if his bat doesn't translate well to major league pitching, we know that his glove is not great. And he's basically a guy with no position. So, if the Mets brought in Murakami and he didn't hit, it's like another guy where it's like, okay, like what the hell, like where the hell do we play him, and what purpose does he serve, on the team? Because if his bat and his offense didn't translate well to hitting major league pitching, you basically have another Mark Vientos type where the guy can't play any defense and you don't feel comfortable at all, hitting putting him in the field because the guy just doesn't play doesn't play well defensively. But there are a couple guys out there that could kind of fit that mold of that Will Salmon, Ken Rosenthal story. Obviously, a guy being Yandy Diaz, the Mets could look to trade for him, or at least look to make a trade for him from the Tampa Bay Rays. But the guy that I kind of do want, and I'm kind of hoping, and I know his posting date is kind of approaching. I believe it's in the first week or the second week of January, I believe, because I asked Carson that yesterday in our group chat, and I believe it's either January 2nd or January 4th. But if the Mets could land a guy like Okamoto and play him at first base, obviously I don't know what that contract is going to look like for Okamoto, but Okamoto is probably the first baseman I want. And the reason I want Okamoto is, one, he's a fairly good hitter. A fairly good all-around hitter, hits well for power, hits well for contact, and he's also a very good defensive player. And he also fits the mold that David Stearns wants for, defensive versatility, because Akamoto, he plays well defensively at first base, he plays well defensively at third base, and he also can play a little bit of outfield, I believe. So, if Akamoto is still available, for me personally, I want Akamoto on this Mets team, playing the majority of innings at first base, and then also sharing that role and responsibility with a guy like Jorge Polanco. Because, like I said, even though Polanco, and he said this in his press conference today where the Mets introduced him, he said that that he kind of already started transitioning a little bit to playing first base last year in Seattle, and he was working with some coaches over there. So thankfully, Polanco's not going to go into spring training just kind of blinded without having no experience at first base. Obviously, like, he doesn't have much in-game experience playing first base, because I believe he only played not even an inning. I think he only played one out, and I think that out was only recorded on one pitch. So like I said, Polanco doesn't have a lot of in-game experience, but thankfully, because of his time in Seattle and because of the work that he was doing over there with their coaches, thankfully he's not going to just transition to first base, at least blindly. At least he already has some type of experience. And I know you guys are also probably also wondering, because if you guys recall back to our last, I believe it was our last live stream we did where we broke down the Luke Weaver signing. Which, if you guys haven't checked out that live stream, make sure you do. I know Evan was kind of asking, and he asked me the question, about Murakami, and I said that for me, I really didn't want Murakami, just because he wasn't proven at the major league level, and he was kind of more of a wild card, because, like I said, you don't know what you're going to get out of the bat from him, and that he's a great defensive player. And I know you guys might say the same about Akamoto. You say, and you guys might also say the same thing about Akamoto, where he's kind of unproven. You don't know what you're going to get. And yes, I do agree that you don't know what you're going to get out of Akamoto necessarily offensively. But the one bright side over him compared to a guy like Murakami is, like I said, Akamoto is a much better defensive player, and he's also defensively versatile, because, like I said, he could play first base, he could play third, he could play a little bit of outfield as well. And like I said, if his bat doesn't translate well to the major league level, at least you have a solid, reliable guy that can play the field, instead of like a guy like Murakami, where if he's not hitting, he's kind of useless. Like I said, he'd fit the mold similar to what he would fit the mold similar to what a guy like Mark Vientos would be. But obviously, we'll see what happens. Guys, before we get out and we finish up this live stream, just gonna go through your guys' final comments. Game Shorts, I already read that comment. Sierra Montre, what is going on? I can see more additions as the money's getting moved out, a la McNeil out, then acquisition to come. I'm under the impression they're staying at number 315 or so. I mean, listen, I don't know what's going to happen with the payroll. Obviously, we saw Steve Cohen kind of have that angry tweet where he was kind of going at the guys who wrote that New York Post article talking about the payroll. Listen, I don't believe the Mets are cutting payroll just to cut payroll. I believe they are trying to listen. I don't think they're going to have like a $450 million payroll, but they're going to put out a good team, and they're also going to have a good enough payroll, again, where you look at the team and you're like, okay, I am comfortable with this number, and I'm comfortable with this team. So, like I said, the Mets, obviously, they are shipping out a lot of money in terms of trades, and also not bringing back guys like Alonso and Diaz, but I believe that they're going to reinvest that money wisely and bring in the right type of guys to, replace not only the roster spot, but also replace the production that other guys like Pete, McNeil, Diaz, and Nimmo were giving you as well. So, but like I said, we'll see what happens. Game Shorts, we got the evil Marte. Hopefully we don't bring back it. Listen, hopefully if we bring in a Marte, it's Ketel Marte and not Stalling Marte, because like even though I like Marte as a as a guy, and as a personality, it's time to move on from Stalling Marte. His contract ran its course. He's older. It's time to move on. Game shorts again. We have some more clutch players. Hopefully, remember 0-70 after 8. That has to change 100%. Hornet, I would have preferred Robert to Mullins at the trade deadline. Yeah, I wanted Robert more than Mullins, but obviously it didn't happen. Then we know how the Cedric Mullins thing worked out. That trade was a disaster, and that's why we saw him take a cheap deal with the Tampa Bay Rays. I mean, good luck to him in Tampa, but yeah, I had enough of Cedric Mullins here in New York. This team still can do a lot and should be decent in the end. Yeah, 100% game shorts. Like I said before or in the live stream, I know that the team on paper right now doesn't look great and it doesn't look sexy. But by the time when we get to spring training and by the time we get to opening day, I think that people are going to be a lot more optimistic about where this team is and where this team will be. But guys, that's gonna wrap it up. Like I said, thank you for you guys. I know this was more of a late live stream, and like I said, I apologies for going live and going live a lot later, because I know this news broke a lot earlier today. I believe it was around 3:30, but we just kind of me and Evan, we kind of couldn't get our schedules together. But thankfully we got the live stream out right now. And like I said, as always, thank you for you guys for coming here, watching us, supporting us, and as always, make sure you guys leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Obviously, like I said, yeah, Jeff McNeil traded to the not the Oakland Athletics, but the A's. Obviously, we'll see what the next move is. I anticipate that there should be some more moves soon. Obviously, I don't think it's going to happen within the next couple of days, just because it is Christmas time. So, I don't think any type of major signings or trade are going to happen now, because I know people probably just want to be with their families. So, but I expect in the first week of January, second week of January, that's when I expect the Mets to make more moves and start to bring in a lot more guys. Who knows? Maybe the Mets could make an addition tomorrow. Obviously, like I said, like we talked about earlier, Stearns has been very quiet and has been very sneaky in terms of his acquisitions this year in the free agent market. So yeah, we'll see what happens. And Game Shorts as well. Happy holidays, Matt. Thank you, Game Shorts. Happy holidays to you as well, and happy holidays as well to all you guys who watch us as well. Because like I said, you guys are the reason why we do this. So yeah, whether you guys celebrate Christmas, Hanukkah, Kwanzaa, Festivus for any Seinfeld fans, whatever holidays you guys just celebrate here, obviously, like I said, happy holidays to you. And, if you don't see us, what's it called, later this week, or, before the New Year's happens, obviously, I don't know if we're going to we'll try to get a podcast episode out, but if you guys don't see us, obviously, like I said, happy holidays. But like I said, as always, make sure you guys leave a like and subscribe to the channel. See you guys later. Peace out. Let's go, Mets.